In the small, sleepy town of Blackwater Springs, nestled deep in the heart of southern Florida, there was a place everyone knew about but no one talked about: Gray's Crocodile Farm. The farm, run by the enigmatic and ruthless Sebastian Gray, had been in operation for over 20 years, but its reputation was enough to make anyone steer clear. Whispers about the farm's dark history circulated throughout the town. Tales of missing workers, eerie disappearances, and the unexplainable sounds that came from the swampy grounds at night. At the edge of the town stood the crumbling, weather-worn gates of the farm. Beyond them, a thick wall of cypress trees and tall grasses concealed what was happening inside. To the townspeople, it was a place of nightmares, but it was also the one business in Blackwater Springs that paid well, and for those desperate enough, the farm was a lifeline. That's how Mark Davis, a 19-year-old college dropout, found himself standing at the gates of Gray's Crocodile Farm. Mark had come to Blackwater Springs looking for a fresh start. Life hadn't been easy for him. His family had fallen apart, his schoolwork never seemed to matter, and his attempts to find a steady job in the city had always fallen short. But when he heard about the job opening at Gray's Crocodile Farm, it seemed like his chance. The pay was good, and the accommodation was provided. Mark didn't hesitate. He needed the money, and more importantly, he needed to escape from his past. As Mark stood at the gates of the farm, the weight of the town's dark reputation hung heavy in the air. He could feel the eyes of the town on him, even though the streets were empty. They were watching him, waiting to see if he would be like the others, the ones who came, worked for a short time, and then vanished without a trace. Despite the unsettling stories, Mark brushed it all off. He was here for the job, nothing more. And Sebastian Gray, the man who owned the farm, was waiting for him. The moment Mark met Sebastian, he could feel the coldness radiating off the man. Tall, with a muscular frame and a face that looked like it was chiseled from stone, Sebastian had the presence of someone who was always in control. His deep-set eyes seemed to watch everything and everyone around him, as if calculating the next move in a game he was destined to win. There was no smile on his face, no warmth in his greeting, only a quiet, almost predatory calm. Sebastian's farm was unlike any place Mark had seen before. It wasn't just a business, it was a fortress. The fences were tall, the gates were heavy and reinforced, and the air smelled of wet earth and something far more sinister, the unmistakable stench of danger. "We raise the finest crocodiles here," Sebastian said with a voice as cold as the swamp waters. "And we only hire the best. If you want to survive here, you must do things my way. There's no room for weakness. Understand?" Mark nodded, a little nervous, but determined to prove himself. Sebastian handed him a set of keys and motioned for him to follow. As Mark entered the employee quarters, he was struck by how isolated everything was. The building was small and dark, with only a few windows that looked out onto the swamp. Inside, the walls were bare except for a few rusted tools and some old animal cages. The air was thick and heavy, like the walls themselves were suffocating under the weight of years of secrets. "This is your room," Sebastian said, showing him a small, unkempt space with a single bed and a dresser. "You'll work with the other men, and you'll do exactly as I say. You're not here to make friends. You're here to work." As Mark settled into the room, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. There was an unsettling stillness in the air, an oppressive weight that pressed down on him. It was as if the farm itself was alive, watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. That night, as Mark lay in his bed, he tried to push aside the ominous thoughts. He had come here to escape, to rebuild, and he wasn't going to let fear stop him. But deep down, he knew that the life he was beginning here at Gray's Crocodile Farm would never be what he expected. And as the dark waters of the swamp lapped against the shore just outside his window, Mark could hear something that made his blood run cold. A low, distant sound, like a croc's hiss. But there was something else in the night air, something that made it impossible for him to ignore. The real nightmare was just beginning. The following morning, Mark woke up to the sound of crocs hissing in the distance. He blinked in the half-light of the swamp's mist and tried to shake off the unsettling feeling that had been haunting him since the previous night. There was something eerie about the farm, something he couldn't put his finger on. It wasn't just the crocs, though they were unnervingly large and powerful. their eyes cold and unblinking. It was the feeling that the entire place was alive with secrets, a dark energy that clung to every corner. After a quick breakfast, Mark was led to the heart of the farm. The main area was surrounded by thick metal fences, topped with barbed wire. Beyond them, large enclosures stretched out, housing dozens of crocodiles. Mark couldn't help but notice how unnaturally still the creatures were, their powerful bodies laying motionless in the muddy waters, their yellow eyes watching every move he made. Crocodiles are more than just animals, Sebastian's voice broke through Mark's thoughts. They're survivors. They have instincts that can't be matched by any other creature. Their power, it's what makes them special. Mark nodded, trying to absorb the words, but his mind kept drifting to the sense of unease gnawing at him. He had been warned about the farm's reputation, but he never imagined it would feel this oppressive. Sebastian handed Mark a long metal pole and motioned for him to follow. They moved to the first pen, where a massive crocodile lay half submerged in the murky water, its jaw slightly ajar. "Your job is simple," Sebastian said, his voice cold and commanding. "You'll feed them, clean their pens, and make sure they're healthy. If one of them dies, it's on you. Understand?" Mark nodded, though he felt the weight of the responsibility settling on his shoulders. The crocs weren't just a dangerous species, they were the key to the farm's success, and the stakes seemed higher than he first thought. As the day wore on, Mark worked alongside the other men, most of whom were silent and distant. Every now and then, Mark would catch a fleeting glimpse of fear in their eyes. They didn't speak much about the disappearances, but there was an unspoken agreement that nobody asked questions. People came and went, and the farm was a place that swallowed them whole without ever leaving a trace. During a short break, Mark decided to speak with George, one of the older workers. George had been at the farm for nearly a decade, and though his weathered face was hard to read, there was a certain sadness in his eyes. "George," Mark started hesitantly, "what happened to the others? The ones who left?" George's hands trembled slightly as he wiped his brow. He glanced around, making sure no one was listening. "You really want to know?" he whispered. "You're not going to like the answer." Mark's heart quickened, but he pushed forward. "Tell me." George looked around once more, his voice low. "They don't leave. They don't just walk away. Some of them." He paused, taking a deep breath. "Some of them end up in the pens. Don't ask questions. Just do your job. If you're smart, you'll keep your head down and stay out of the boss's way." Mark felt his blood run cold. The words, "end up in the pens," echoed in his mind, and the implications hit him like a punch to the gut. He had heard rumors, sure, but to hear it from someone who had been working here for so long was a different matter entirely. "Are you saying that, Sebastian?" Mark trailed off, unable to finish the thought. George's eyes flashed with fear, and he shook his head. "I didn't say anything. Just stay away from the boss. And whatever you do, don't get too close to the crocs." Mark stared at the old man for a moment, trying to make sense of what he had just learned. But before he could ask more, Sebastian's voice called out from across the yard. "Mark!" Sebastian shouted, his tone sharp. "You're not here to talk. Get back to work." Mark quickly straightened up, guilt surging through him. He had pushed too far, asked too many questions, but it was too late. The seed of doubt had already been planted, and now he couldn't ignore the creeping suspicion that something deeply sinister was unfolding at Gray's Crocodile Farm. As Mark returned to work, he cast a wary glance toward the pens. The crocodiles were still, too still. Their cold eyes watched him, unblinking, as though they knew something he didn't, something he might not live to find out. The next few days on the farm dragged by in a blur of routine, but Mark couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that had taken root in him. Every time he passed one of the crocodile pens, the creature's unblinking yellow eyes seemed to follow his every move. The air, thick with the scent of swamp and decay, felt like a constant weight pressing down on him. But it wasn't just the crocs that made Mark feel uneasy. It was the strange behavior of the workers around him. They were distant, avoiding eye contact, and rarely spoke to him unless absolutely necessary. One morning, Mark was tasked with cleaning the pens near the farthest edge of the property. The pens were larger here, and the crocodiles more aggressive. Mark moved cautiously, aware of the enormous creatures lurking just beneath the water's surface. He had learned quickly that getting too close to the pens, especially during feeding time, was a dangerous mistake. The crocs could move faster than he ever imagined, and the workers' warnings about the accidents that had occurred on the farm began to take on a terrifying weight. As Mark worked, he noticed something that didn't sit right. One of the pens was empty, except for a few bloodstains smeared across the concrete floor. The surrounding water was disturbingly still, almost as if it had been drained. He couldn't remember a time when that pen had been empty, but he didn't dare ask anyone. Instead, he tried to push the thought from his mind and focus on his work. That afternoon, Mark took his usual break by the far side of the property, where the rest of the workers gathered to eat and rest. As he sat down beside George, he noticed the older man was visibly shaken, his hands trembling as he unwrapped a sandwich. "You okay?" Mark asked, his voice low. George didn't respond at first, his eyes darting nervously around the yard. Finally, he spoke, barely above a whisper. "I've been here too long. I've seen too much." Mark leaned in, urging him to continue. "What do you mean?" George's eyes locked onto Mark's. "It's not just the crocs, boy. It's the farm itself. There's something in these woods, something that gets into your head, makes you forget who you are, who you were." Mark's stomach tightened. He had heard these kinds of half-formed warnings before, hints of something far darker than what they'd let on. But now it was starting to feel like they were all connected. The disappearances, the strange behavior of the workers, the silence that hung over the place. "George, what's really going on here?" Mark asked, his voice steady but filled with urgency. George's face went pale, and he shook his head, glancing over his shoulder as if someone might be listening. "I shouldn't say any more. If you want to stay alive, you'll forget you ever heard my name." Mark's heart raced. He was about to press George for more, but just as the words began to form, Sebastian appeared at the far end of the yard, his cold eyes scanning the workers. The tension in the air became palpable, and without a word, the workers quickly scattered. George gave Mark a pleading look, as if warning him not to push any further. "Forget it," George muttered under his breath as he stood up and walked away, leaving Mark alone with his thoughts. That evening, Mark decided to take matters into his own hands. He had to know the truth. He couldn't keep working under the cloud of fear, not knowing what was really going on. After everyone had gone to bed, Mark sneaked out of his room and made his way back to the pens. His heart thumped in his chest as he moved quietly through the dark, the air thick with the sounds of crocs hissing and the occasional splash in the water. As he neared the empty pen, his flashlight illuminated the bloodstains on the concrete floor. The sight made his stomach churn. Something was wrong, something that didn't add up. Suddenly he heard footsteps behind him, soft and deliberate. He turned quickly, but no one was there. His pulse quickened. Was someone watching him, or was it just his mind playing tricks on him? A low growl interrupted his thoughts. Mark's flashlight swung wildly, landing on the shadowy outline of one of the crocs, its massive jaws snapping in the dark. He froze, realizing just how close he had come to the creature. His breath came in short gasps as he stepped back slowly, not daring to take his eyes off the massive beast. And then he saw it. At the far end of the pen, hidden beneath the overgrown vines, was something Mark couldn't quite believe. It was a body, or what was left of one. His heart pounded in his chest as he rushed forward, flashlight shaking in his hand. The body was mutilated, its limbs torn apart by the crocodile's powerful jaws. But what caught Mark's attention was the face. It was familiar. Too familiar. It was the face of Tom, one of the workers who had disappeared just days ago. The realization hit Mark like a sledgehammer. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't just a wild animal attack. Someone had been feeding people to the crocodiles. Someone was using the farm for far more sinister purposes than he had ever imagined. He turned to leave, but as he did, a voice called out from the darkness. "Did you find what you were looking for, Mark?" Sebastian's cold voice echoed in the night air, sending a chill down Mark's spine. Mark spun around, his pulse racing. What is this place? What's really going on here? Sebastian stepped into the beam of Mark's flashlight, his face expressionless. What you choose to see here doesn't matter, Mark. You'll learn soon enough that people who ask too many questions don't stay around long. Mark's heart pounded in his chest. He wasn't sure if Sebastian was threatening him or just stating a fact. But one thing was clear. He had uncovered something terrible, and now he was a part of it. The farm seemed to hum with an eerie silence as Mark made his way back to his small, dimly lit room. His mind raced with what he had just discovered. The image of Tom's mangled body haunted him, the blood still fresh in the crocodile pens. Sebastian had known he was there. He had been watching. Mark had never been so terrified in his life. But his fear wasn't just about the gruesome discovery. It was the realization that he had walked into something far worse than he ever imagined. The farm wasn't just a place where animals were bred. It was a trap. A twisted, grotesque game played by a man who was more monster than human. Back in his room, Mark paced, unable to shake the feeling that something far darker was closing in on him. The walls of his small space felt suffocating, and he could hear the faint sound of crocs growling in the distance. The noise wasn't just coming from the pens. It felt like the sound was echoing through the very walls of the farm. Mark realized that the swamp itself was alive, breathing with secrets, and every croc was a part of that secret. Suddenly, the sharp click of the door lock startled him. His hand instinctively reached for the small flashlight beside his bed, but before he could move, the door creaked open. He turned, his heart in his throat, expecting to see Sebastian or one of the other workers. But instead, there was nothing, only the sound of the crocs in the distance. Mark was on edge, convinced that he had heard something, someone, at the door. He stood frozen for a moment, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. His breathing slowed as he finally approached the door, his hand resting on the knob. But as he opened it slowly, there was nothing there. It was just a gust of wind, he thought. Just his imagination. But as Mark stepped back into his room, his eyes caught something unusual on the floor. A small, blood-stained rag lay near the corner of his room. The red stains were unmistakable. It was fresh blood. Mark's stomach churned as he bent down to inspect it, his fingers trembling as he picked it up. It was torn fabric, like something someone had worn. His mind raced as he wondered what it meant. Who had been in his room? Suddenly, there was a loud bang coming from down the hall, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Mark's pulse raced as he moved to the door, peering through the crack. The hallway outside was dark, the only light coming from the flickering overhead bulb. Mark's instincts told him to stay hidden, to keep quiet and out of sight. But his curiosity got the better of him. He had to know. Carefully, he crept down the hallway, his heart hammering in his chest. As he reached the end of the hall, the sound of the footsteps grew louder. He turned the corner and froze. There, standing at the far end of the corridor, was George. The older man was standing completely still, staring at the floor. But what caught Mark's attention was the look on George's face. It was pale, sweaty, and filled with fear. George's hands were shaking as he held something tightly in his grip. Mark stepped forward cautiously, his voice barely above a whisper. "George, what's going on? What are you doing here?" George's head snapped up, and for a moment Mark saw something strange in his eyes. It was as if George wasn't entirely there, like something was controlling him. He blinked, shook his head, and then spoke, his voice cracked and low. "You shouldn't be here, Mark. No one is supposed to know. You have no idea what he does, what he's been doing." Mark took a step closer. "Who, George? What's going on? What did you mean? What is he doing?" George's hands trembled as he pulled something out of his jacket pocket. It was a small, folded piece of paper. He handed it to Mark, his hands shaking uncontrollably. "It's all in there," George whispered. "It's all the truth. It's the price of the farm, the sacrifices." Before Mark could say another word, George turned and fled down the hallway, disappearing into the darkness. Mark stood there, his mind reeling. The piece of paper crinkled in his hands as he stared at the darkened hallway where George had vanished. What was that about? Sacrifices? The truth? He unfolded the paper and read the hastily scrawled words. "Sebastian Gray isn't just a man. He's a predator. He feeds the crocs with anyone who's weak enough to disappear. The farm is his kingdom, and we are just pawns. If you value your life, leave now, or you'll become part of the collection." Mark's stomach dropped as the words sank in. He could feel his heartbeat pounding in his ears. The horror that had been a whisper was now a cruel, undeniable truth. The workers had been right. They had all become trapped in a deadly game, and the only way to survive was to escape. But how could he leave? Sebastian's eyes were always watching, always calculating. And the crocs, those terrifying creatures, were his enforcers. Every step he took, every move he made, was under the watchful eyes of the very monsters that could end his life in an instant. Mark knew that now, and he realized something even more chilling. Escaping this farm wouldn't be as simple as walking out the door. To escape, he would have to outsmart not just Sebastian, but the deadly creatures he had raised to hunt. Mark spent the next few days trying to make sense of what he had read on the piece of paper. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the horrifying images of the crocs tearing into their victims. The words haunted him. The farm is his kingdom, and we are just pawns. The more he thought about it, the more he realized George wasn't the only one who was trapped here. The entire farm, with its eerie silence and distant growls from the pens, was a prison for everyone who worked there. And now, Mark had unknowingly become a part of this deadly game. But despite the fear clawing at his mind, Mark knew he couldn't just sit idly by. He had to escape. But there was a problem. Sebastian's eyes were everywhere. The farm was isolated, surrounded by the swamp, with no easy way out. Even if he managed to slip past the gates, the crocs would be there, waiting for anyone who tried to flee. One night, unable to sleep, Mark crept out of his room, his mind burning with a need to know more. The paper George had given him had revealed the truth, but it hadn't given him the answers he needed. What was Sebastian's ultimate goal? Why had he chosen this twisted life of sacrifice? As Mark moved quietly through the darkened halls of the workers' quarters, he could hear the distant slapping of crocodile tails against the water and the low hissing sounds that made his skin crawl. The barn-like building ahead, where Sebastian spent most of his time, was dark. The doors were shut tight, but Mark knew that the real secrets of the farm lay behind them. He waited until the workers had settled into their rooms. The farm was eerily quiet at night, and for the first time, Mark allowed himself to breathe without the feeling of being watched. He slipped into the shadows, careful not to make a sound. His footsteps were barely audible against the cold concrete floor as he made his way to the barn. The door creaked slightly as he pushed it open, his heart hammering in his chest. Inside, the barn was much larger than Mark had imagined. It was a place of strange machinery and cages, all designed for one purpose: to breed and contain the crocodiles. But it wasn't just a breeding ground. As Mark crept deeper into the barn, he noticed something even more disturbing. There, in the center of the room, was a large metal table. It was covered in what looked like old bloodstains, the smell thick in the air. The table seemed out of place, the only object in the barn that wasn't directly related to the crocs. Mark approached it cautiously, his pulse racing, when he noticed something else that made his stomach lurch. On the wall above the table were several photographs, some faded with age, others shockingly fresh. The images were of people, workers, perhaps, standing next to Sebastian, smiling. But there was something off about them. The people in the photos had eyes that were dull and lifeless. They were no longer fully human, Mark realized. They were no longer themselves. The same fear that had haunted the workers' eyes during the day now seemed to haunt these photographs. Mark reached out a trembling hand to touch one of the photos, but before he could do so, a loud noise erupted from behind him. He spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. Sebastian was standing at the entrance of the barn, his cold, piercing gaze locking with Mark's. "I thought I made it clear, Mark." Sebastian's voice was low and menacing. "Questions will get you nowhere." Mark's breath caught in his throat. He had been caught. There was no denying it now. He was trapped in the web Sebastian had woven, a web that no one could escape from. His mind raced, thinking of ways out, but every possibility seemed impossible. Sebastian stepped closer, his footsteps heavy in the silence. "I know what you're thinking," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "You think you can outsmart me, but you're wrong, Mark. You're already too deep in. You're part of the farm now. You always have been." Mark took a step back, his mind spinning. "What do you mean?" he whispered, his voice shaking. "I'm not part of this. I'm just trying to leave." Sebastian's lips curled into a cruel smile. "You're more than you realize. You're part of something greater than yourself. The crocs, the farm, it's all about survival, about feeding the hunger that lives inside us all. You've already made the choice, Mark. Now you just have to embrace it. Mark's head was spinning. The truth was becoming clear, but it was something he didn't want to face. Sebastian wasn't just a murderer. He was a man who had embraced the darkness inside him, who had turned his entire life into a ritual, feeding the crocodiles with fear and sacrifice. He didn't care about the workers or the victims. They were just tools to him, used for his own twisted purposes. With a sudden, terrifying realization, Mark understood that his life no longer belonged to him. He had become another piece of Sebastian's monstrous puzzle. But there was one thing he could still do: fight back. Mark reached for a nearby metal rod and raised it in defense, his hands trembling. "I won't be your sacrifice," he said, the words coming out more forcefully than he expected. Sebastian's expression faltered for a moment, his eyes narrowing as if measuring Mark's resolve. Then, with a quick, fluid motion, he lunged forward, knocking the rod from Mark's hands and sending him crashing to the ground. Mark's vision blurred from the impact, but he could still make out the shape of Sebastian towering above him. "You should have stayed away," Sebastian murmured, his voice cold and emotionless. "Now, you'll learn just how far I'm willing to go to protect my kingdom." Mark, struggling to breathe, realized he was too far gone. He was tangled in Sebastian's web, and there was no escape. At least, not without paying the ultimate price. The air in the barn was thick with tension as Mark lay on the cold concrete, his head spinning from the brutal impact of his fall. Sebastian stood over him, the towering figure of the man almost suffocating in the dim light. Mark could barely catch his breath, his chest rising and falling erratically, but the fire of defiance still burned inside him. He couldn't let Sebastian break him. Not now, not after everything he had learned. Sebastian loomed above him, his cold eyes glinting with twisted amusement. "You think you're the first to try and escape?" His voice was almost a whisper, but it carried with it a venomous certainty. "You won't be the last either. But you will be the one who makes it clear to the others that there is no escaping the farm. The crocs will have their share, and so will I." Mark struggled to his feet, wiping the blood from his lip. He was dizzy, his vision clouding as he staggered to stay upright, but he couldn't afford to lose control. He had to get out. Every part of him screamed to run, but he knew that wasn't possible. If he made a run for it, Sebastian would have him. The farm was a maze, and Sebastian had already demonstrated just how well he controlled everything. "You've made a terrible mistake," Mark said through clenched teeth, his voice barely a rasp. "I'll expose you. You won't get away with this." Sebastian's eyes hardened as he stepped closer, the air growing colder between them. "Expose me? How exactly?" His lips curled into a sinister smile. "I control this place. I control everything here. The workers, the land, the animals. They all answer to me. You think anyone will believe you? After all, you're just another worker, just another nobody who disappeared, just like the rest." Mark could feel the suffocating weight of Sebastian's words as they hung in the air. He knew that escaping wasn't going to be easy, but he also knew he couldn't let Sebastian win. Not now. Without warning, Mark lunged forward, using all his strength to shove Sebastian off balance. It was a desperate move, but it caught the man off guard. For a split second, Mark saw something in Sebastian's eyes, a flicker of surprise. But then the cold, calculating mask quickly returned, and Sebastian lunged at him, knocking him to the ground again. "Foolish," Sebastian spat, grabbing Mark by the collar and lifting him off the ground. "You're just like the others, too weak to see the bigger picture. The crocs are not the only predators here, Mark. There's a much bigger hunger in me, one that will never be satisfied. And now, you're part of it." Mark struggled to free himself, the grip on his collar tightening, but desperation gave him strength. As Sebastian held him up, Mark caught a glimpse of the metal table from earlier, the one covered in bloodstains. The thought of it filled him with a cold dread, and suddenly, a plan began to form in his mind. The next moment, Sebastian's grip loosened just enough for Mark to bring his knee up sharply into the man's stomach. Sebastian let out a grunt of pain, staggering back slightly. In that split second, Mark managed to push him away, sending Sebastian crashing into a pile of crates. Without thinking, Mark bolted toward the door, adrenaline pushing him faster than he had ever run before. His mind raced with possibilities, but the one thing that kept him focused was the image of the gate, his only way out. He reached the door, his hand trembling as he gripped the handle. But as he pulled it open, something caught his eye, a large, dark shape moving in the shadows outside. Mark froze, heart pounding. He didn't need to look twice to know what it was. The Crocs. They were closing in. The realization hit him like a slap. The farm wasn't just about keeping him in. It was about keeping anyone who tried to leave from escaping. Sebastian had been playing a twisted game with them all along. His enforcers were the creatures themselves, the ones who would hunt anyone who tried to break free. Before Mark could make a move, a loud roar echoed from behind him. He turned just in time to see Sebastian coming at him again, this time with a maddened look in his eyes. Sebastian's hands were raised, and his expression was that of a predator closing in on his prey. "You're not going anywhere," Sebastian sneered, his voice filled with dark satisfaction. Mark's heart pounded in his chest. There was no way out. The barn was a trap. The Crocs were too close. And Sebastian was a monster. Suddenly, the ground beneath them shook, and Mark heard the unmistakable sound of a Croc's roar, a sound so primal and violent it made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. It was coming from the pens. The Crocs were restless, angry. And then, just as quickly as the sound had started, a massive creature burst through the barn doors. Sebastian's face went white. "No," he muttered under his breath, but it was too late. The Croc lunged forward, snapping its massive jaws just inches from Sebastian. The man let out a strangled scream as the creature grabbed him by the arm, dragging him into the dirt. The scene unfolded before Mark like a nightmare. Sebastian was helpless, caught in the jaws of one of the Crocs. His cries echoed in the barn as the massive reptile tore into him with vicious force. Mark backed away slowly, unable to tear his eyes away from the horrific spectacle. He had seen the cruelty that Sebastian had inflicted on others, but seeing him consumed by his own creation was something else entirely. In that moment, Mark realized that Sebastian's empire of fear had finally collapsed. The Crocs, once his tools of terror, had turned against him. But Mark knew this was only the beginning. There was no going back now. The barn was chaos. Sebastian, the man who had controlled everything at Gray's Crocodile Farm, was now at the mercy of the very creatures he had raised to obey his commands. Mark stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest, as he watched Sebastian's futile attempts to break free from the jaws of the massive crocodile that had dragged him to the ground. The croc was relentless, its powerful jaws crushing down with each violent movement. Sebastian's screams were muffled by the sound of snapping teeth and the wet slaps of the creature's massive tail as it thrashed wildly. The air was thick with the stench of blood and decay, and the sight of the farm's brutal reality unfolded before Mark in a way he couldn't quite comprehend. He should have felt relief. Sebastian, the man who had subjected him and the others to this hell, was finally paying the price. But Mark didn't feel victorious. He didn't feel anything but horror. The Crocs were just another piece of this deadly puzzle, and for all their power, they were no different than the monsters that lurked in the hearts of men. The creature let out a final growl before dragging Sebastian's body beneath the surface of the nearby water, disappearing into the murky depths. The barn fell silent, save for the rhythmic sound of Mark's own breathing. He stood there for a long moment, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. It was over. But was it really? As the darkness of the barn pressed in around him, Mark couldn't help but feel like the farm's curse was far from finished. Sebastian was gone, but the Crocs were still there. And the farm itself, it was still standing. The gates were still locked, the workers still trapped, and there was no sign of escape. Mark had come to believe that if he could get out, he could put all of this behind him. But now, in the wake of Sebastian's death, he realized that leaving wasn't going to be that easy. The truth was clear now. He couldn't leave without facing the full horrors of what the farm had become. Mark glanced around the barn, his eyes falling on the large metal cages where the remaining crocodiles lay, seemingly dormant. But in the dim light, their eyes glowed with a strange, unnatural intensity. The farm was their home, their kingdom, and it would not let him go without a price. His thoughts were interrupted by a voice, low, cold. "I thought you would be smarter than this, Mark." Mark whipped around to see George standing in the shadows, his eyes wide with fear. The older man was holding a small knife in his hand, the blade reflecting the faint light of the barn. Mark couldn't understand. George had been trying to warn him, trying to help him, but now it seemed like he was a part of the trap too. "George?" Mark asked, his voice hoarse. "What's going on? Why are you—" George stepped forward, his expression tense. "You don't get it, do you? The farm. It's not just about Sebastian. It's about something much bigger, something that goes beyond the Crocs. The farm is alive, Mark. The land itself, it takes what it wants, and it's been feeding on us for years." Mark felt his stomach twist. "What do you mean, feeding on us?" George's eyes were wild with fear. Every worker that disappears, every sacrifice made, it's not just for Sebastian's greed. The land, the swamp, they want it. The Crocs are just part of the ritual. You've seen the pictures, right? The ones in the barn? Mark nodded. The photos, the workers. They all look the same, empty. They are, but they weren't always. They were once part of this place. This land chooses its own, and once you're in, once you've worked here, you're bound to it. You don't just leave, Mark. You become part of it. The swamp, it feeds on you. Mark felt a cold chill run through him. The words seemed impossible, but the fear in George's eyes made them feel real. "But why are you still here?" Mark asked. "Why haven't you left?" George lowered his head, his hands shaking. "I can't. None of us can. We're all part of it now, Mark. The swamp won't let us go. If we try to leave, we become part of the sacrifice. You'll see." Mark took a step back, his mind racing. He couldn't believe it, but the pieces were starting to fall into place. The Crocs, the disappearances, the pictures, everything pointed to a dark truth he wasn't ready to face. A sound in the distance broke his thoughts. The growl of another crocodile, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps approaching. The Crocs were restless again. Mark could feel it in the air. Something was coming. And it wasn't just the Crocs. The farm was awake. The land was hungry. "George," Mark whispered, his voice urgent. "We need to get out of here. Now." George looked at him with a mixture of sadness and resignation. "You can't run from this, Mark. The farm won't let you." Before Mark could respond, the growling grew louder, and he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps, the heavy, deliberate steps of someone coming closer. He turned, but it wasn't Sebastian. It wasn't even George. It was a figure emerging from the shadows. A man. Taller, broader, his face covered in a mask of black mud and leaves. And in his hands, he held a large machete. Mark froze, his heart hammering in his chest. He didn't know who this man was, but he could feel the same cold presence that had surrounded Sebastian. The man raised the machete. "You're too late, Mark. The farm always wins." Mark's breath quickened as the man with the machete stepped closer, his every move deliberate, almost predatory. His face was obscured by a mask of mud and swamp debris, but Mark could see the cold, calculating gleam in his eyes. Eyes that spoke of years of indoctrination, of living in a place where human life had little meaning. This man was no different from Sebastian, a tool of the farm, a servant to the land's twisted hunger. Mark backed away slowly, his mind racing. He had no weapon, he was alone, and there was no way out. But there was something inside him now, a spark of defiance that refused to be extinguished. The farm had tried to break him, to make him a part of its darkness, but he wasn't ready to give in. Not yet. "What do you want?" Mark asked, his voice steady but laced with fear. The man said nothing. He only lifted the machete higher, the blade glinting in the dim light of the barn. The sound of Crocs growling in the distance seemed to grow louder, more agitated. Mark could feel the land itself responding, as though the farm was watching, waiting, ready to claim him as its next victim. "Don't fight it," the masked man said finally, his voice rough, almost hollow. "It's inevitable. This place, it takes what it needs, and now it needs you." Mark's stomach tightened. He could feel the weight of those words hanging in the air. The farm wasn't just a place of work. It was a force, alive in its own way, feeding off the fear, the pain, and the suffering of those who were trapped here. And now it was coming for him. But Mark couldn't let it claim him. Not like it had claimed the others. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, Mark lunged at the masked man, catching him off guard. He managed to knock the machete out of the man's hands, sending it skittering across the floor. The man staggered back, but he didn't fall. Instead, he reached for something else, a heavy rope coiled around his waist, and threw it over Mark, binding him with terrifying speed. Mark struggled, trying to free himself, But the more he fought, the tighter the rope became. His breath came in short gasps as the masked man pulled him to his feet, his grip unyielding. Mark could see the cold determination in the man's eyes. There was no escape from this. "You should have left when you had the chance," the masked man said, his voice low, almost pitying. "But now you'll become part of the sacrifice. The land has claimed you." Mark's pulse raced. His mind was frantic. He couldn't let this happen. He couldn't let them win. In that moment, a realization hit him. If he was going to survive, he would have to face the truth about the farm, about the creatures, and about himself. With all the strength he had left, Mark yanked himself free from the man's grip, using every ounce of his body to break the rope. He fell to the ground with a crash, his chest heaving as he scrambled to his feet. The masked man lunged at him again, but Mark was faster now. He dove toward the machete, grabbing it just in time to block the man's next strike. The barn was filled with the sound of clashing metal, the blade of the machete ringing against the concrete floor as Mark fought to stay alive. Every move he made was desperate, fueled by the raw will to escape. But the masked man was relentless. He swung the machete with deadly precision, each strike getting closer to Mark's body. The crocs in the pens were becoming more agitated, their growls growing louder. Mark could feel their presence in the air, like a storm waiting to break. The land was hungry, and it was watching. Mark ducked as the machete sliced through the air, narrowly missing him. In that split second, he saw an opportunity, a gap in the man's defense. With a swift movement, he lunged forward, knocking the machete from the man's hand and sending it spinning across the barn. The masked man staggered back, his breath ragged as Mark raised the blade, his grip tightening. "This ends now," Mark said, his voice trembling but resolute. The masked man looked at him with a mix of fear and disbelief. "You don't understand," he gasped. "You can't kill what's already dead." Mark didn't hesitate. In a single motion, he swung the machete, severing the man's hold on the farm's dark grip. The masked man fell to the ground with a thud, his body crumpling into the shadows. For a moment, everything was still. The crocs were quiet. The barn was silent. Mark stood there, the blade still in his hand, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. But the silence didn't last long. From the shadows, something else stirred. Mark's heart skipped a beat as he turned to face the corner of the barn, where the low growl of a croc echoed through the air. The massive creature slowly emerged from the shadows, its eyes glowing in the dark. It was one of the largest crocs Mark had ever seen, its scales glistening in the dim light. It was the same croc he had seen earlier, the one Sebastian had used to feed his twisted desires. Mark knew the truth now. The crocs weren't just animals. They were part of the farm, part of the curse that had held everyone here captive for so long. And if he wanted to escape, he would have to destroy that curse, once and for all. The croc lunged, its massive jaws snapping shut just inches from Mark's face. He jumped back, narrowly avoiding its deadly teeth. The fight wasn't over yet. But for the first time, Mark felt a spark of hope. He wasn't just fighting to survive anymore. He was fighting to destroy the heart of the farm, to break the curse that had claimed so many lives. With the machete in hand, Mark stepped forward, ready to face the last challenge, the fight to survive and escape the nightmare that had become his reality. The massive crocodile loomed before Mark, its eyes locked onto him with a chilling intensity. The barn, once a place of silent oppression, now seemed to hum with the energy of impending violence. The air was thick with the stench of decay and fear. Mark could feel the weight of the moment settling around him. This was it. The final stand. The croc hissed, its sharp teeth bared as it slowly advanced, its massive body moving with surprising agility for its size. Mark's grip tightened on the machete, his knuckles white with the force. He had faced fear before, Sebastian's cruelty, the dark secrets of the farm, but this was something else entirely. He wasn't just fighting to escape anymore. He was fighting for his life. With a sudden, terrifying lunge, the crocodile snapped its jaws just inches from Mark's face. He darted to the side, barely evading the crushing force of the animal's teeth. The barn trembled as the croc swung its massive tail, crashing it into the nearby wall with a deafening thud. Mark stumbled but regained his footing, narrowly avoiding the creature's next strike. The croc wasn't just a mindless predator. It was smart. It knew exactly where to strike, where to force Mark into a corner. It was a creature bred for violence, for survival. And Mark was its prey. Mark knew he couldn't keep running. He couldn't keep dodging forever. The farm had already taken so much from him, his freedom, his sense of security, his very sanity. He couldn't let it take him too. He needed to fight back, to show that he wouldn't be another nameless victim, another sacrifice to the farm's insatiable hunger. With a battle cry, Mark rushed forward, the machete raised high. The croc lunged again, jaws wide, but this time Mark was ready. At the last moment, he swung the machete with all his strength, aiming for the croc's underbelly. The blade sliced through the air, embedding deep into the creature's thick hide. The croc recoiled, letting out a deafening roar of pain. Mark didn't hesitate. He pressed the advantage, driving the blade deeper into the wound. The croc thrashed violently, trying to shake him off, but Mark held firm, the machete buried in its side. The creature's tail lashed out, narrowly missing Mark, but he kept his focus. He had to finish this. Finally, with one last determined thrust, Mark drove the machete into the croc's heart. The creature's body went limp, its powerful muscles seizing in death. Mark stumbled back, panting, his body covered in sweat and blood. The croc's massive form crashed to the ground with a deafening thud. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. The barn was still, the air thick with the smell of death and adrenaline. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he stood over the creature's lifeless body. He had done it. He had killed the thing that had haunted his every step since he arrived at the farm. But the victory felt hollow. The real battle was never just about the crocs. It was about escaping the nightmare that had consumed the farm. And while he had slain the beast in front of him, he knew the land's hunger wasn't so easily quenched. Mark turned toward the barn doors, puffed his breath ragged as he moved toward the exit. He had to leave. The croc was dead, but there were still others out there, and he knew that escaping wasn't just about killing the monsters. It was about getting out before the land itself swallowed him whole. But as Mark reached the door, he heard something that froze him in place. The sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps. He turned around, his heart racing, as a shadow loomed in the doorway. It was Sebastian. The man was standing there, his eyes cold and unblinking, as though nothing had happened. Mark's pulse raced. He had seen Sebastian die. He had watched the crocs drag him into the depths. There was no way he could have survived. But here he was, standing in front of him, as calm and calculating as ever. You're dead, Mark whispered, disbelief filling his voice. Sebastian's lips twisted into a cruel smile. You're wrong, Mark. I'm more than dead. I've always been more than dead. The farm keeps us all alive, in one way or another. We are its caretakers, its protectors. And when you killed the croc, you didn't just kill an animal. You killed a part of this place. And that is something the farm does not take lightly. Mark's blood ran cold as he realized what Sebastian was saying. The farm wasn't just about control. It wasn't just about feeding the crocs. It was about something far darker. The farm was alive, and it had been feeding on the workers for years. Sebastian hadn't just used the crocs for his own twisted pleasures. He had been using the farm's power to keep them all trapped here, to turn them into pawns in a much larger, darker game. You can't be real, Mark muttered, shaking his head. Oh, I'm real, Sebastian said, his voice low and ominous. I'm as real as this place, and now you're part of it too. Mark's hands trembled as he gripped the machete, but the weight of the situation began to sink in. There was no escaping the farm, not now, not after what he had done. The land would always take what it needed, and the only way to escape was to become part of the cycle. But Mark wasn't ready to give in. Not yet. He didn't care what Sebastian said. He wasn't going to let the farm win. He wasn't going to let it claim him like it had claimed so many others. With a final defiant cry, Mark lunged at Sebastian, the machete raised high. But as he moved forward, the ground beneath him trembled. The walls of the barn shook, and the air grew heavy, suffocating. The land was awake, and it was hungry. Mark's final battle was only just beginning. Mark stood in the barn, his breath shallow, his body covered in sweat, his mind spiraling into confusion. The machete shook in his hand, not from fear, but from sheer exhaustion. Every muscle in his body screamed at him to stop, to surrender. But something in his soul refused. Something deep inside him told him that if he didn't fight back now, if he didn't destroy this place, He would become just another lost soul, another pawn in Sebastian's twisted game. The ground beneath him trembled again, harder this time, the air growing thick and suffocating. Mark's heart raced as he realized the full horror of what he was dealing with. The farm wasn't just an ordinary place. It was alive. It fed on fear, on pain, on the souls of the workers who had come and gone. And Sebastian wasn't just a man. He was a part of it, just like the crocs, just like the land itself. Sebastian's laugh echoed through the barn, dark and chilling. You don't get it, do you, Mark? This place, this land, it doesn't let go. It never has. And now you're part of it. No matter how hard you try, no matter how much you fight, you can't escape. The farm will claim you, just like it claimed all the others. Mark gripped the machete tighter, his knuckles turning white. He could feel the weight of Sebastian's words, but he wasn't ready to give in. Not yet. The crocs might have been a part of the farm's hunger, but so was Sebastian. And now that he had seen the truth, there was no turning back. I'm not like you, Mark said through clenched teeth. I'm not a part of this place, and I won't let it take me. Sebastian stepped closer, his eyes cold and unblinking. You're wrong. You're already a part of it. You always have been. Suddenly, the barn's walls seemed to come alive. The floor cracked beneath Mark's feet, the wood groaning as if the very foundation of the farm was shifting. The crocs in their pens roared, their massive jaws snapping, their eyes glowing in the dark. The land was awake, hungry, and it was pulling them all deeper into its darkness. Mark could feel the weight of the farm's power pressing down on him, but there was a fire inside him that wouldn't be extinguished. Not by Sebastian, not by the farm, not by anything. With a final roar, Mark charged toward Sebastian, the machete raised high. The ground shook beneath his feet, but he didn't stop. He had to end this. He had to destroy it all. Sebastian, the farm, the curse that had bound them all. Sebastian's eyes narrowed as he saw Mark coming, but he didn't move. He stood there, waiting. You think you can defeat me? You think you can destroy what's already been built? Mark didn't answer. He swung the machete with every ounce of strength he had left, aiming for Sebastian's throat. But as the blade made contact, a strange, unnatural force stopped it midair. Mark's hand went numb, and he was thrown backward, crashing into the ground. The barn seemed to come alive in a way Mark couldn't comprehend. The walls groaned, the earth trembled, and the very air seemed to thicken around him. He struggled to his feet, but the force pressing against him was too powerful. It wasn't just Sebastian. It was the land. The farm itself had come alive to protect its master. Mark gasped for air, feeling the darkness closing in on him. He could hear Sebastian's voice, cold and mocking from the shadows. You think you can destroy me? You think you can break the curse? This land is mine. It always has been, and you will never leave. Mark's vision blurred, and for a moment, he thought he was going to lose consciousness. The weight of everything, the crocs, the farm, the horrors of the past few days, was too much to bear. But then, in the deepest part of his mind, a spark ignited, a thought, a realization. Sebastian wasn't the only one with power. The farm wasn't just alive because of Sebastian. It had been built on the backs of the people who had worked there, the ones who had been sacrificed, consumed, lost to the land. And those souls were still here. They were still part of the farm. Mark's eyes flew open. He wasn't alone. He had never been alone. With a burst of energy, he pushed himself up, breaking free from the oppressive force holding him down. The farm seemed to shake as if it were protesting. Mark felt the souls of the workers, the ones who had disappeared, the ones who had been consumed by the crocs, by the land, surrounding him. They were angry. They were ready to be freed. In that moment, Mark understood. The farm wasn't just a place. It was a prison for the souls of the lost, and a prison for Sebastian himself. And he was the key to breaking it. With a cry, Mark swung the machete one last time, and this time, it connected. The blade pierced the air and struck Sebastian with a force that sent shockwaves through the barn. Sebastian screamed, a terrible, guttural sound that echoed through the farm, reverberating through the walls, through the earth itself. For a moment, everything was still. Then, with a final sickening thud, Sebastian crumpled to the ground, his body still. The oppressive force that had held Mark down faded, tapped, and the barn fell silent. Mark stood over Sebastian's body, gasping for breath, his hands trembling from the sheer force of what had just happened. The farm, the land, the curse. They were all still there. But Sebastian was gone. The crocs, too, grew quiet. The hissing stopped, the growling faded. And then, as if on cue, the ground began to crack. The earth beneath Mark's feet split open, and the barn began to collapse, the walls caving in around him. It was over. The farm had been broken, but as Mark made his way toward the door, he realized something. The farm wasn't gone, not entirely. The curse, the hunger, would always remain. But he had freed the souls trapped here. They had helped him fight back. They had helped him break the cycle. Mark took one last look at the crumbling barn. The land was still hungry, but it would never take him. Not again.